Good morning, everybody. It is another week of Sunday School. It is another week with the Action Bible. And this week and next week, we have two sets of stories from Israel's history that are just really, really important because they're very formative. They set a foundation for Israel's story going forward. And Israel comes back to these time and time and time again. Now, what we have today is starting with the book of Exodus, and we start with Israel being enslaved by the Egyptians. Remember, of course, last week, Joseph was on top of the world. He was the second in command of Egypt, and his family was Pharaoh's honored guest. But this week, time has passed, maybe a couple of hundred years, and they have forgotten who Joseph was. And now their fortunes have changed, and they are no longer guests, but they are slaves. And it's a particularly bad kind of slavery. We read about them being more and more oppressed and having to do more and more work. But also, we can't lose sight of the fact that Pharaoh was killing their babies. Now, this is one of the ways the Bible works. Pharaoh was killing their babies. 1,000 years later, when Jesus is born in Bethlehem, King Herod sends his soldiers into Bethlehem to kill the babies. It's almost like when the Gospel of Matthew tells us that story, he's saying, remember how Pharaoh did this? And remember how Moses had to be the deliverer for people of Israel? Well, now Herod's doing it, and Jesus is the deliverer. So they're in slavery. Then we have this idea of Moses being a deliverer. And if you read carefully, you'll see that Moses at first wants to be a deliverer in his own way. He decides how he wants to do things, and that doesn't work out well for him, and he's banished off to Midian. So again, we have Moses who's a deliverer and first tries to do things his own way, and only then comes to God's ways. But we also have Jesus, who is the great deliverer from sin, death, and the devil, and he comes and he does it all God's way, all the time. And that deliverance is important too, because, God visits some pretty nasty plagues on the Egyptians. And next week it gets worse. And sometimes we might think, wow, I can't believe that God was so hard on the Egyptians, that he'd be so mean to them. And it's important that we recognize that in this instance, Egypt is considered an enemy of God. So when Jesus comes, he doesn't visit plagues on human beings like you and I, because when Jesus comes, he reminds us that all humans are created in God's image and God loves them all. No, the enemies that Jesus comes to destroy are sin, death, and the devil. So these stories are very important for Israel. They shape the way they understand their whole life for over 1,000 years. And they're important for us because they point us ahead to Jesus, who is the author and perfecter of our faith. I hope you enjoy these stories this week. I'll be back again next week to introduce the next unit.